All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're asking maybe the biggest question of all. What is reality? We're about to pull back the curtain on everything you think you know, and trust me, it's gonna get weird. So let's just jump right in.
So let's kick things off with a little thought experiment. I want you to just look around you for a second. That chair you're sitting in, the device you're watching this on, it all feels pretty solid, right? Real? But what if it's not? What if everything, the very fabric of our world, is more like an illusion or a dream, or maybe even just a bunch of code?
You know, this reminds me of a great quote from the sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick. He basically said reality is the thing that, well, doesn't go away just because you stop believing in it. And that makes sense, right? It's stubborn. I can't just decide I don't believe in gravity and start floating around the room. It feels like a really solid place to start, but let's see if it holds up. Okay, and right away, this is where those simple, common-sense ideas start to get a little shaky. If reality is just what our senses tell us, what do we do with things like optical illusions or phantom limb pain? It feels real, but it's not, right? And if it's just what a lot of people agree on, what about mass delusions? There's this wild phenomenon called Koro, where entire groups of people have become convinced their bodies were shrinking. And as for stubborn, I mean, a nightmare can feel incredibly real and stubborn while you're in it. On the flip side, the stock market, something that feels very real and impacts our lives, would literally disappear overnight if we all just decided to stop believing in it. So yeah, this question is way trickier than it first seems.
So, if we're going to get anywhere with this, we need to move past our gut feelings. We've got to find some more rigorous definitions. So let's look at a couple of big philosophical ideas about what real actually means.
First up, there's this idea of the world without us. Just think about that for a second. Reality, in this view, is everything that would still be here if humans had never existed. You know, the mountains, the stars, the laws of physics. But that means things we think of as totally real, like language or money or governments or even wars, they don't make the cut. They're not real because they're just creations of our collective minds. It's a very clean definition for sure, but also pretty restrictive.
Okay, the second big idea is all about reductionism. The thinking here is that reality is only made up of the most fundamental things, the absolute base layer of existence. Imagine a giant pyramid, right? Everything on top rests on the layer below it. Well, reality is whatever you find at the very, very bottom, the stuff that doesn't depend on anything else. And honestly, this is the definition that's really going to take us down the rabbit hole.
All right, so if we're hunting for those most fundamental things, let's start our journey. And we'll start with something that feels about as real as it gets. Just a plain old rock.
There's this famous story about Samuel Johnson kicking a stone to prove that matter is real. And you get it, right? That thud, that feeling of solid hitting solid. It's a pretty convincing argument. But what are we actually kicking? When your foot hits that rock, what is it really made of?
And this is where things get their first big twist. Because if you could zoom all the way in, way down into the atoms that make up that rock, you'd find, well, mostly nothing. An atom is over 99.999% empty space. So that solid feeling, it's not one thing bumping into another. It's actually the electromagnetic force pushing the electrons in your shoe away from the electrons in the rock. You're not touching the rock, you're feeling a force field.
And okay, let's zoom out even further now, from the rock to the entire universe. It turns out that all the stuff we think of as matter, the atoms that make up you, me, the planets, the stars, all of it, is only about 4% of the universe. The other 96%, it's this mysterious stuff we call dark matter and dark energy that we frankly barely understand at all. So the big takeaway is that what we think of as normal reality, it's just a tiny, tiny slice of what's actually out there.
So we've already established that matter isn't very solid. But now we're going to go even deeper, down into the quantum world. And this is where the fundamental pieces of matter stop acting like things at all. This is where all our common sense just completely falls apart.
Check this out. There's a famous experiment that shows just how bizarre this all is. If you shoot a whole beam of electrons through a tiny opening, they hit a screen on the other side and form a wave pattern, kind of like ripples in water. Which is weird enough, because electrons are supposed to be tiny particles, right? Not waves. But here's the crazy part. If you slow it down and shoot them one at a time, each one hits the screen as a single tiny dot. But if you let that run for long enough, mapping out all those thousands of individual dots, they build up to form that exact same wave pattern.
So how is that possible? How does each individual electron, traveling all by itself, know where it's supposed to land to create this larger pattern with all the others? It's not talking to them. It's as if the single electron exists as a wave of every possible path it could take, and then, poof, it becomes a single particle at just the right spot to help build that pattern.
This is what physicists call wave function collapse. It's that moment when something goes from being a ghostly cloud of probabilities to being an actual thing in one specific location. So what causes this collapse? What flips the switch? Well, that is one of the single biggest arguments in physics. The trigger seems to be measurement or observation.
So if matter itself just dissolves into a cloud of maybes when we try to look at it too closely, then what's at the bottom of that pyramid we talked about? If it's not little solid particles, then what is the universe really made of?
Well, there are basically three leading theories, and all of them are pretty mind-bending. The first is that reality isn't just described by math. It is math. The second is that reality is fundamentally information, like we're living inside a giant computer. And the third, which might be the wildest of all, is that reality is somehow created by consciousness.
Let's dig into that first one. The physicist Max Tegmark makes this incredible argument. He says the universe isn't just explained by math, it is math. The reason our equations work so well to predict everything from black holes to subatomic particles is that the universe itself is a giant mathematical structure. A shape like a dodecahedron doesn't have to be built out of anything, its mathematical properties just exist. And maybe our universe is the same way.
Okay, idea number 2. Reality is information. At its core, this theory says everything in the universe can be broken down into bits, into simple yes or no questions. This leads to something called the holographic principle, which is just as cool as it sounds. It suggests that our entire 3D world could actually be a projection, a hologram, of information that's stored on a flat 2D surface at the very edge of the cosmos. Yeah, our universe is a hologram?
And that brings us to the third and maybe most radical idea. It's actually been kicked around by some of the founders of quantum mechanics like Max Planck. Remember that whole wave function collapse thing, where a cloud of possibilities becomes one single reality? Well, what if the observer that's needed to make that happen has to be a conscious mind? In this view, consciousness doesn't come from matter. Matter comes from consciousness. Without a mind to observe it, the universe would just be an infinite soup of every possibility, all happening at once.
So when you take all this uncertainty, a reality that's mostly empty space built on pure probability that might just be math or information, it all funnels down into one huge, very modern question.
The philosopher Nick Bostrom laid out this really powerful argument. It goes like this. If any civilization ever in the history of the universe gets advanced enough to run super realistic simulations of their ancestors, they're not just going to run one. They'll run millions, maybe billions of them. And if that's true, just do the math. The odds are overwhelming that we're not the one original base reality. Statistically, we're almost certainly living inside one of those simulations.
So let's just recap this wild ride for a second. Where did we end up? We started by kicking a rock, something totally solid, only to find out it's an illusion made of empty space. We dove into that emptiness and found a quantum world built not on solid things, but on pure chance and probability. That made us ask what reality's true foundation is, which led us to these crazy ideas that it's all just math, or information, or maybe even consciousness. And if you put all that together, you're left with a very real, very modern possibility that this entire world is a simulation.
And that's the final question I want to leave you with. Let's just say it's true. Let's say this world, your life, your memories, your feelings, it's all part of a hyper-realistic simulation. Does that make it any less real? If the rules work, if the pain hurts and the joy feels good, is it any different to us living inside it? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.